Chapter 42 5 August 1942 The morning was warm and muggy. Every day for the past 9 months, a large group of Rikers Island inmates, most of them political prisoners, had been herded from a tightly segregated section of the camp onto construction barges bound for Hart Island. The group was known as the Sonderkommando, Special Unit. Natalie Rosenbaum was the only other inmate with whom they were allowed to have any contact. Every morning, each of the Sonderkommando workers would show his left forearm to Natalie as he boarded one of the barges, and she would record the tattooed serial number in her ledger. When the barges returned in the evening, she would record the numbers in her ledger again. But on this morning, as the last of the barges carrying the Sonderkommando were getting under way, and Natalie began to leave, one of the guards shoved her with his rifle and ordered her to remain at the dock. She watched as 2 more empty, rust-covered barges approached from downriver. In his overcrowded barracks, Saul Rosenbaum was laying on the wooden shelf he shared with a half-dozen other inmates. 2 SS guards suddenly kicked open the door at the other end of the barracks. "Aufwachen! Wake up!" they shouted, storming into the barracks. "Aufwachen!" "Stand!" one of the guards shouted as the inmates slowly began to rouse themselves out of the wooden racks. Those who couldn't stand on their own were helped by the others. They lined up on either side of the barracks, many of them hunched over, unable to stand upright. The guards made their way down the 2 long lines of inmates, one guard inspecting each line. Every so often, one of them would stop and single out an inmate, motioning for him to join a line at the center of the barracks. Saul Rosenbaum was the last to be selected. As he stood at the back of the line, ready to be marched from the barracks, Saul noticed that all the men in front of him had one thing in common. They were all elderly and sick. Several of those who had been chosen were unable to walk on their own, prompting the impatient guards to assign younger, healthier inmates to help them. Out into the sultry morning they marched, a ragged, sorrowful procession of helpless old men whose only crime was being of Jewish descent. As they were herded across the camp, they were joined by other groups of old men. A comparable number of women, also elderly and sick, were marched in separate groups. By the time they reached the dock, where the 2 empty barges waited, their number had swollen to nearly 500. The guards formed a barricade to keep the male and female prisoners separated. Saul desperately scanned the large huddle of female inmates at the other end of the dock. Even though they all presented the same shabby appearance, he was able to pick her out of the crowd. "Esther!" he shouted as he held his hand high above the throng and waved. "Saul!" she shouted back, recognizing her husband's voice. She frantically scanned the crush of men, but was unable to find him. Saul began pushing his way through the mass of humanity. When he reached the dividing line between the male and female prisoners, one of the guards shoved him back. Standing off to the side with her ledger, Natalie Rosenbaum noticed the scuffle on the dock. She caught a glimpse of her father. "Papa!" she screamed. As she started to run toward him, one of the guards reached out and grabbed her. He slung her hard to the ground, sending her glasses flying. They landed on the concrete, cracking one of the lenses. Slowly rising to her feet, she found the broken glasses and picked them up. By the time she put them back on, she could no longer see her father among the hundreds of other prisoners. Natalie heard rumbling and booming in the distance. At first, she thought the Allied bombers had returned. But as she saw the dark black clouds churning over the Bronx, she realized a thunderstorm was moving in from across the river. The guard who had slung Natalie to the ground grabbed her by the collar and pulled her to the ramp next to the first barge. As the frightened women were forced into the cargo hold one at a time, Natalie began counting. Halfway into the count, there was a similar face looking back at her, just out of arm's reach. "Mama," Natalie said in a frail whisper. Esther Rosenbaum, her sunken eyes filled with tears, blew a kiss to her distraught daughter. "I love you, Natalie." Several more prisoners passed down the ramp before Natalie could gather herself to resume counting. When all the women were loaded, she entered the total into her ledger. Several guards removed the ramp and carried it to the second barge. As the first barge got underway, the loading process began again. Saul Rosenbaum managed to linger on the dock until all the other men had boarded. When she saw her father at the end of the line, Natalie moved closer to the ramp. As the guards restrained her, she extended her hand. She managed to briefly touch her father's outstretched hand as he was pushed onto the barge. Natalie fell to her knees, weeping. The barge moved slowly through the water. As Saul Rosenbaum stood with the other prisoners crammed into the steel cargo hold, the storm clouds opened up on them. 300 yards away, just north of the river, a flash of lightning showered sparks from the roof of a Bronx tenement building. A split second later, the clap of thunder left Saul's ears ringing. The barge continued east as the heavy downpour drenched everyone on board. The rain became so intense that the shoreline was no longer visible from the middle of the river. Saul had no idea where the Nazis were taking him and his fellow inmates, but he was certain this would be his and Esther's final day on Earth. He prayed that when Esther's time came, she wouldn't know until the very end. He also prayed that, for her sake, the end would be quick. As the storm grew even more violent, the wind churned the waters around the barge. The overloaded vessel began to pitch and roll as it rounded Throg's Point and headed north into Long Island Sound. Some of the men became ill. Because they had not eaten in weeks, dry heaves were all they could muster. When they landed on Hart Island, the first barge had long since offloaded and departed. The women were nowhere in sight. The SS guards drove Saul and his fellow inmates from the barge and marched them toward one of the two cinder-block structures. Rectangular in shape, each building stretched more than 100 yards. In the distance, just beyond the rear of the buildings, 3 red incinerator stacks towered above the camp. As they marched, Saul and the other prisoners passed an SS general and several aides. While the callous general watched the inmates slog past him in the driving rain, one of the aides held an umbrella over his head. 2 more aides stood next to the general, behind cameras mounted on tripods. Several prisoners, members of the Sonderkommando, who had arrived ahead of the other inmates, held a canvas over the cameras as the aides snapped photographs. When they arrived outside the entrance to the windowless structure, the rain suddenly stopped. The men stood silently outside the entrance to the building. As the storm clouds parted, the mid-morning sun began beating down. Steam began to rise from the tops of the prisoners' shaved heads. An SS officer, carrying a megaphone, stepped up onto a wooden platform next to the steel doors at the front of the building. He informed the men that they were fortunate to be the first Rikers Island inmates processing into a newer, cleaner camp. The SS officer's morose tone belied the cheerful message he was delivering. He told the men they would be issued fresh uniforms after they showered inside the building. He ordered them to remove their clothing. As more prisoners assigned to the Sonderkommando began gathering the piles of discarded uniforms, a pair of guards opened the steel doors. The men were herded through the entrance, into a single long chamber. Saul Rosenbaum was one of the last men shoved into the building. He heard the large metal doors groaning on their hinges as they clanked shut behind him. A small glass skylight was the only thing that separated the men from total darkness. The lack of ventilation in the crowded space made it hard to breathe. Some of the men became claustrophobic. Others became uneasy as they looked up toward the large shower heads above them. Several nervous shrieks began to echo through the cavernous chamber. Then, as they heard boots reverberating on the metal catwalk above the ceiling, the men fell silent. At the end of the chamber farthest from Saul Rosenbaum, the guard on the catwalk dropped the first open canister of Zyklon B pellets into one of the pipes. Everyone trapped in the building heard it ping against the inside of the metal showerhead. As the hydrogen cyanide began to vaporize, it flowed through the showerhead holes and into the chamber. Those directly under it were the first to inhale the deadly fumes. As they breathed the gas, they began to choke. Some tried in vain to hold their breaths. Their lungs burned and their eyes watered profusely as they attempted to push their way toward the other end of the chamber. Their efforts were futile. One by one, canisters fell into the remaining showerheads. Saul Rosenbaum could hear the pinging as it got closer and closer to him. He and several others began pushing against the metal doors. They were locked tight. The wave of panicked cries moved swiftly toward Saul and the other men at the door. By the time the last canister fell, the first victims were already foaming at the mouth and bleeding from their ears. Without enough room to fall onto the concrete floor, many began to convulse violently in a squatting position. As he began to choke, Saul prayed for strength. He desperately wanted to die with dignity. Though he was suffocating, he found the strength to prop his back against the metal door. His body began to seize. After spasming for several excruciating seconds, Saul felt a sudden sense of calm. As he closed his eyes, he heard Esther gently calling his name. Then, as his soul was slipping away, he saw Natalie. She was dressed in a beautiful white gown, standing alone beneath a chuppah, the traditional Jewish wedding canopy. Tears flowed down her cheeks. Several heartbeats from everlastingness, and unable to speak, Saul Rosenbaum reached out subliminally to communicate his dying message to the fading vision of his daughter. "It's going to be okay, Quetzal. He'll send for you soon."